Hello and welcome back to our study of the Old Testament. We're in the book of Esther today. We're going to be exploring this final book uh, in the study of the Old Testament history. After Esther, there'll be this intertestamental break between the events of the Old Testament and then the birth of Christ. Before we jump in it, I just wonder what it would be like for each of us if we had someone to protect us. Let's say you were being bullied or something and you needed someone to help protect you. Well, a movie like that came out in the early 80s. There was a young boy, he was in high school and he was being bullied really bad and really got hurt quite a bit at the hands of 4 or 5 boys. So what he did is he goes out and he finds a bigger boy on the streets and hires him to be his bodyguard. The movie is actually called that, My Bodyguard. And the whole story unfolds with the relationship between this bodyguard and this young boy and how his protector, if you will, was somewhat of the reluctant hero. He didn't necessarily like violence, didn't want to participate in violence. But when he saw the injustice being done to this young boy, he couldn't help but to step in and help. What would it be like to have someone like that in our lives? How would it make you feel in times when you may feel threatened to have this protective hand to cover you? Well, it's this hand that is covering the Jewish people as we come to the book of Esther, this hand of God, this providing, protecting, providential hand that's taking care of his people of promise, his children, in whom he has sealed his promise of covenant. Esther tells the story of how God's hands of protection and providence are there on behalf of all of his people. And in the book of Esther, even though God's name is not even mentioned once, we can't help but to sense this protective hand of God. We see it ultimately come up through the hands of Haman's plot against the Jewish people and what he plans to try to have done to Mordecai himself. And as we get through this book, this theme of protection, or more importantly, the term providence, will become more apparent in how God is taking care of his people of Israel and how through their faith, he is enacting big things, big protections on their behalf. So let's jump into the book of Esther and begin our study tonight. Tonight, I want our study to be a little bit more interactive, as much as a video class can be interactive. And so I'm going to ask you to pause the video at certain points in our study to do some reflecting upon your own. And hopefully, through our study tonight, not only what I share with you, but what you come up on your own will be a lot more informative, be a lot more helpful and transformative in this particular book. This is just a beautiful book of faith, of protection, of God's providence. So many lessons that can bleed over into our own lives in terms of how we relate and interact with the world around us. So what we're going to do is we're going to jump right in to some of the keys that I always like to look at when we're talking about each particular book. The first key that I want us to take a look at is a key word in the book of Esther, and it has to be this word that we've already talked about, providence. Now, providence is kind of a vast term in which we say where God is in control of things and moving things, but that can sometimes, that wide-ranging definition of providence can sometimes be problematic for some people when it comes into the suffering that individuals go through. If God is a protector, if God's protective hand is upon me, if his providence is always upon his people, then where is he while I go through this? Now that is ultimately a question of suffering. Job will ask that question, as so many people have asked it throughout their lifetime. So I don't want us to necessarily spend our time tonight talking about the role of suffering in this term of providence, but I do want us to do some reflecting, if we can, just right off the bat, of what we think the term providence means. So if you will, just take a moment to pause this video and begin just on a sheet of paper defining this word and what you feel like it means. What does it mean that God provides for us or is providential in our lives? Take a moment, if you will, to reflect upon that, and then we'll come right back. Well, now that you've taken some time to write and reflect upon that, I hope you know that there's not necessarily any right or wrong answer here. It's more of an answer to a question from your own life experience. It's each of us have had different things happen into our lives in which we have tried to interpret it in ways in which it makes the best sense for us. But ultimately, when we're talking about this idea of providence, that God is providing and protecting for his people, I think in the context of the book of Esther, we got to look at it from two different perspectives. There's first the threat that happens, and then there is the triumph for the believer in terms of what happens. And once again, these words are vast, but each of us in our lives have experienced different types of threat, different types of suffering, ways in which we have come to question to some extent or the other, where is God in all of this? And that existential question that we ask ourselves can lead us to a point of crisis of faith in which we began to contemplate, is God even protecting me? Well, that's what I mean by the threat, the threat of the outside world, the things that Satan throws at us in each and every one of our lives to cause us to begin that process of doubt, in which we begin to question the even remote interest of God in our daily affairs. And because of that, we can become stuck, if you will, in our faith, in which we can't move forward because we can't make sense of the present. The future isn't able to become more clearly in view in our relationship with God, because we're stuck in a current point with God in which our relationship isn't making much sense. And so this threat, this what begins as this physical outside threat upon each and every one of us, can in many ways become this internal spiritual existential struggle in each and every one of our lives, where we're trying to make sense of how God is acting, or is he even acting in our lives. This is somewhat at the core of the question of suffering. Why do good people suffer? And ultimately, my basic answer to that question is we suffer because we live in this broken world. And for Esther and for all of the Jews at this time, they were living with the consequences, yes, of their forefathers' choices, but ultimately they were living in a world that was broken by sin. And this sin was causing these threats in their lives, in which it seems like they had no control, and was even perhaps beginning to question, does God even have control? And so these threats for them, as the threats do for us, lead us down this road in which we begin to say, God, where are you? Well, this broken world has been redeemed through the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. It's through him that all things are made possible, in which we can now experience this hope that we call our resurrection in which God will take our bodies, either dead or alive at the time, and will resurrect us to be with him forever in eternity. But yet we live in this already but not yet time in which the world is still broken, but we as God's people have been redeemed. And so these threats that we talk about have to then be moved away from this concept of a broken world and moved into the reality for the believer, that our triumph over these threats are made possible through the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. And because that has been made possible through Jesus Christ, whatever happens to us in this physical world does not change that ultimate reality. And so when we're talking about God's providential care of his people, and in particular of how he was working to take care of the Jews in the time of Esther, the way we have to look at this and the way we have to interpret this is, regardless of whatever happens in this life to us physically, our ultimate destination is made possible through Jesus Christ, and therein lies our triumph. And God has provided that means. God has providentially acted in each and every one of our lives through the death, burial, and resurrection of his Son, so that we can experience that ultimate triumph, even if it means suffering in this world. Esther will have a rather interesting response to Mordecai when Mordecai asks her, who knows, for such as a time as you have not been made ready for this. And her response is basically, and I'm going to paraphrase here in light of our comments, I'll go, and if I die, I die. It is that statement of faith that recognizes that whatever happens to me in this life happens not because God wants it or God wills it, but because it's the reality of the world that we live in. You see, for Esther to go before the king and make any type of request without being invited by the king could possibly mean her death. Does that mean that God is not caring for her? Absolutely not. It doesn't mean that at all. But what Esther's view, or what her reality was, is that God is going to provide for me whatever happens, whether in life and death. And so as we're looking at the life of Esther, and as we look at our own lives as well, and we talk about this word providence, I hope that we can see it in light of our spiritual reality as children of God. That we are not defined by the realities of this world, we're defined by the realities made possible through Jesus Christ. And God has provided for us. He has providentially acted in the lives of each and every one of us so that can ultimately be each and every one of our realities. And so we don't respond necessarily out of fear, although we may at times be afraid, but we respond out of faith that if we die, we die. Well, let's continue looking next at some key verses in the book of Esther. Excuse me. Well, as we continue looking at some key things from this particular book, let's look now at some key verses that come out of this particular book. And I want to start with Mordecai's conversation with Esther, particularly in chapter 4 and in verse 14. Mordecai has this to say to her: "For if you remain completely silent at this time, relief and deliverance will arise for the Jews from another place, but you and your father's house will perish. Yet who knows whether you have come to the kingdom for such a time as this." I'd like for you to take a few moments, if you can, and reflect on this passage and what it might be saying to you today and what you think it might have been saying to Mordecai and Esther at their time. I'm going to just ask if you'll pause the video for a few minutes, and on the paper that you just used for the last exercise, do the same on this. Reflect on this verse and ask yourself the question: what could it possibly mean for me in my life today if Mordecai was to say this to me? Go ahead and pause your video. Well, as I reflect on this verse, there's just seems to be so much wisdom and just spiritual godly faith that comes out from Mordecai in this passage. But before we just really jump into that, I want to just kind of notice right off the bat what he has to say to Esther. For if you remain completely silent at this time, relief and deliverance will arise for the Jews from another place, but you and your father's house will perish. It's almost as if Mordecai recognizes a fact that each and every one of us experience in our own lives when it comes to a point where we must stand up for God, to exercise our faith in a way that may not be popular to the masses, that may not be maybe even popular in a church setting, but to where we have to make the conscious choice: will we say something or will we remain silent? It's a truth that is available to each and every one of us. We don't necessarily have to speak out. Now, I know that's no new revelation to you, but I want you to notice the other side of that comment from Mordecai's perspective. He truly believes that through providence, God is going to act in a way as to change this king's decree that's about to come down upon the Jews. And he goes to this queen at a particular time in which tensions were probably at their highest for the Jewish people, and basically says to her, you've got a choice. Now, for me, I might, in my reflections when I was looking on this, the first thing I thought in my head is that if I was Mordecai, I wouldn't be giving her an option. I would be so concerned about myself and my family and dying that I would basically say, you're the queen. You've got to do this. You've got to go up over there. You're our only hope. But Mordecai looks further down the road than that. And he truly believes that this God of Israel, this God who has made covenant with the children of Israel, of Abraham, will not allow them to be destroyed. And there's a message, a truth for each and every one of us today, that as God's children, God will not allow us to be destroyed. That no matter what's happening in our world, no matter how crazy it might seem to be, God will not allow you to be destroyed. As we've said earlier in our study, He has providentially made that impossible. But yet He has left us with the choice to accept that providential care. To make the choice of standing up and being the person of faith in the room rather than the person of fear in a room. Of understanding that, if I don't say anything, I may be safe now. But what's to happen to me later if I don't speak up? Trusting in God to protect us, trusting in God to be providential in our lives, means that we look beyond the moment of anxiety, that we look beyond the moment of the threat and look to the triumph that's been made possible in our lives. And that's what empowers us. That's what makes it possible for us to be able to step out in those moments of fear and do it in a way, as Esther will do, with faith. To where we act in such a way as to God would have us to act, because we know that whether we live today or die today, tomorrow God has provided for us the triumph. And so as we look at this verse, Mordecai is acknowledging that fact, is that no matter what happens, no matter what choice you make, Esther, God is going to protect us. So the question for you is, do you want to be a part of that deliverance, or do you want to be quiet? But in all of it, contemplate this, that who knows that for such a time as this, God has not prepared you for this moment. See, God prepares men and women for great moments. And great moments are made possible through the faith of great men and women. And for each and every one of us, as we come into the threats that this world provides for us, for our children, for our families, it's not a question of, will I run in fear? It's a question of, do I want to be a part of a message of a deliverance that God has already made possible? Do I want to be part of that message? And so in Esther chapter 4, verse 14, we are being called to be those people of faith in very trying times. I don't have to ask you to spend a lot of time reflecting upon the realities of the world in which we live in today. It seems that every time we turn the corner, something is happening in which ungodly things are happening all around us. So it's left up to us, will we remain silent at this time? If we choose to be silent, that's okay, but please know, God's not going to let his people be destroyed. You may not be the one that he uses to deliver that message, or maybe you could be. The choice is left in our hands. For who knows? For such a time as this, God has not prepared you for that great moment. Well, a second verse that I would like for us to look at is found right after 14, verses 15 and 16, but I'm only going to read from verse 16 here. Esther says, "Go gather all the Jews who are present in Shushan, and fast for me, neither eat nor drink for 3 days or nights. My maids and I will fast likewise. And so I will go to the king, which is against the law. And if I perish, I perish." Here's the answer that Esther has to Mordecai's message to her of, will you be the person for such a moment as this? She says, yes, I will. I will be that person. But I want us to notice right off the bat that what happens here is she doesn't immediately go to the king. No, what she does instead is that she prepares herself spiritually to go and take such a step. And therein lies a lesson for each and every one of us today. So in the next few moments, I'm going to ask you to pause the video again, and I'm going to ask you to reflect upon this question. In trying times, in situations to where you feel probably how Esther felt at this moment, when you feel the most threatened, to use our word again, how do you prepare yourself? Take some time and reflect upon that. When we ask the question of how we prepare ourselves, Esther gives us a wonderful example of ways that we can prepare ourselves when we are entering into the battle, if you will, with this world. And the first thing she does is she activates the faith of her spiritual community. She sends messages out to all of the people of Israel and asks them to fast, pray, that she might have the strength and the words, if you will, not to put words in her mouth, but ultimately that's probably what she was seeking. The wisdom as she goes before the king to say the right thing in a way that helps the people rather than hurts the people. You and I live in a world today in which individualism and ruggedism and lifting yourself up by your own boots is something that's built even into our Constitution, this idea of the individual and the self-made man, if you will. Now, I'm not here to downgrade that. I think there are wonderful principles there that bring on accountability and bring on the importance of accepting responsibility for oneself. But ultimately, when we are in spiritual battle, God does not want us to go it alone. And so Esther provides for an example is that as she gets ready to enter this spiritual battle, she wants to go with the people of faith behind her. And you and I have been given such a community as well. Our church family are people that ultimately will pray for us, provide for us, walk along beside of us in these journeys of trials and tribulations that we may experience. So I think ultimately when we are preparing ourselves to go into battle is we must recognize the fact, let's not go into that battle alone. Let's activate a community of faith that God has given us on each and every side to do things that help bring us to a point in relationship with God and the relationship with them in which we will act in godly ways and wise ways. And so that's exactly what she does, is she activates this faith community. And the second thing that it allows for her is to go into this situation with faith rather than fear. As she says, I will go up to the king, which is against the law. And if I perish, I perish. This view of Esther was that I will rise up to this call that God is placing upon his people. I will rise up and do the thing that you ask me to do for my people. But I will not do it alone. I want the people of God to be in prayer for me, fasting and asking God to give me strength. And no matter what happens when I step into the proverbial Daniel's, the lion den that we read about like in the book of Daniel, when we step into that lion's den or into that fire of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, we step in there not as people of fear, but as people of faith, because we've activated a faith community that is beseeching God on our behalf as we are doing the same, that we may be acting in ways that bring honor to him in the message that he is sending before the world. So prepare yourself this day to go into a world that is just as troubled. All right, so in the time we have remaining, we're going to do a survey of this book. I'm not going to do this the way that we've done it in the past, because I really wanted to center today's message on this idea of providence and being people of faith. But I am just going to real quickly show you how the book can easily divide itself up for your own study. And I'm going to put another chart up on the screen for you to look at here. Let's go ahead and put that up. You'll notice that the focus of this book can be divided into two parts. The first 4 chapters, if you will, are focusing upon the threat to the Jews, this existential threat outside of the Jewish people themselves, in which plans are plotted for revenge against individual and against the individual Mordecai and against the Jewish people themselves. And this plan that's being hatched is using the king as a pawn, if you will, in which he is just ultimately making decrees to accomplish this threat that's being made to the Jews. And that leads us down to a topic point in this, is that everybody's in grave danger. All the Jewish people are in grave danger. But we have this turning point in chapter 5, where it turns from threat to triumph of the Jews, in which godly people began to step up, as we've already looked at, and began to act in ways in which remove the threat and ultimately destroy the threatener. And that leads us to this topic point of this great deliverance. In chapters 5 through 10 are going to tell the story of how God, through his providential care, rises up Esther and gives her a message that ultimately saves the Jewish people from this threat and destroys those that were threatening the Jews. So that's just a really quick survey, if you will, of the book of Esther. And I hope you've had some time today to really reflect upon this message of providence and what God has already provided for each and every one of us. So my prayer is that we go forward in our study, that we'll be looking at the prophets, and we'll be looking at some of the books of poetry. We won't dive into each and every one of those books, but we'll just be taking some pretty key messages from each and every one of those books of literature, and looking at how it might apply for our lives today. So God bless you, and we'll see you again next week.